It's been done before for the noble reason of healing a divided country, a blanket pardon of nameless citizens. President Carter gave one to Vietnam draft dodgers. President Jackson gave one to the Confederacy. President Washington gave one to the fighters in the 1794 Whiskey Rebellion. But in our third story in the countdown, what if President Bush follows suit for a distinctly less than noble reason and pardons everyone involved in carrying out his policies on interrogation, torture, and rendition? It begs another question, one that we will ask of President-elect Obama nightly until his inauguration. What do we do now? Throughout his campaign, Obama promised to stop torture and to close down Gitmo, promises he reaffirmed to 60 Minutes.
There are a number of different things that you could do early pertaining to executive orders. Right. One of them is to shut down Guantanamo Bay. Mm-hmm. Another is to change interrogation methods that are used by U.S. troops. Are those things that you plan to take early action on?
Yes. I have said repeatedly that I intend to close Guantanamo, and I will follow through on that. I've said repeatedly that America doesn't torture, and I'm going to make sure that we don't torture. Those are part and parcel of an effort to regain America's moral stature in the world.
But just how does the president-elect go about achieving those aims? If he closes Gitmo, what happens to the prisoners? Do they move under U.S. judicial jurisdiction, in which case they will likely be released for lack of evidence? And if they are released, will their home countries take them back? And can the U.S. ensure that those who did commit terrorist acts don't commit any more? As far as the torture policy, Salon.com is now reporting that President-elect Obama's advisors are pushing forward with a plan for a nonpartisan commission to investigate abuses under the current administration. It would not preclude prosecutions, but would emphasize fact-finding above all else. And the results would likely not come to light until after Obama's first term. But President Bush could stymie any effort to bring forth criminal charges by issuing a blanket pardon for anyone who was involved. In doing so, he would not only be admitting that his policies in the war on terror were a crime, potentially a war crime, but he would also be pardoning hundreds, maybe even thousands of people who had knowledge of or took part in the interrogations. And that, in a first, would mean that President Bush essentially pardons himself for his criminal acts, something that not even Nixon felt comfortable doing. I'm joined now by Jonathan Turley, constitutional law professor with George Washington University. And Jonathan, thanks for your time tonight.
Hi, David.
If President Bush does take this remarkable step of offering a blanket pardon, does that mean that nobody involved in the U.S. torture policy is prosecutable ever?
Well, this is not as easy as it sounds, because it's a bit of a tricky thing to do when you can pardon thousands of unnamed people. Most pardons have to name people. Even if they haven't been convicted of a crime, you have to name the crime. And it's going to be rather a big challenge for him. He'll have to essentially pardon the world. And I'm not too sure how that will play out if later there are prosecutions. It would be a terrible, terrible precedent. There's a big difference between John F. Kennedy pardoning people convicted under the Narcotics Act, an act that many people felt was really excessive, and Bush giving this sort of generally worded pardon for all crimes associated with a program. That would allow presidents to have a virtual criminal enterprise going on from the beginning to the end of their term, and then just issue a blanket for a pardon for everyone in their administration. It would be a terrible, terrible precedent.
And as far as that precedent is concerned, I mean, if there are no prosecutions, doesn't that send that very message that any administration can essentially break American and international law with impunity?
See, I think that's the important distinction. This issue has never been about the principle of torture. That principle that we don't torture already existed. It existed in international law. It existed in domestic law. The principle we've been debating for the last, 8 years is the principle of the rule of law, whether a president is above the law. And what I think you're seeing now is a bit of a bait and switch, where the Democrats are turning this into a question of whether we will finally denounce torture. We already did that many years ago. The world did that many years ago. The question is whether the Democrats will stand with the rule of law and demand an investigation of crimes.
What about Gitmo? I mean, what happens to all those people inside the prison? How does President-elect Obama weigh their rights with national security concerns?
Well, he can finally do what Bush should have done. and that is simply move these people into the federal system. The problem is that some of these people have been tortured. Many of them, there's very little credible evidence against them. But they could be moved into the federal system and given a fair trial. And if we cannot convict them under the rule of law, then we can send them back to their countries if they'll accept them or hold them until they do. But the important thing is to get these people out of limbo, out of a very arbitrary and abusive situation, and to stand with our own system of laws. You know, that's the thing that is distinguishing us from the people that we have fought against. And I think the world has viewed the last 8 years as the United States embracing the type of abuses and, in fact, embracing the hypocrisy of our enemies.
Jonathan, as you know, Richard Nixon's lawyers figured a self-pardon would be legal under the Constitution, but he decided against it. In your opinion, would that have been legal, and would it likewise be legal for President Bush to essentially pardon himself?
This has long been a big parlor game of a debate for academics of whether a president could pardon himself. The language of the Constitution would indicate that the president has plenary and almost absolute authority over pardons. I don't think it's that easy. I think that the Constitution's spirit and the history behind the Constitution indicates that the framers never anticipated a president could pardon himself. The Constitution is all about conflicts of interest and trying to avoid Congress from giving itself a pay raise, trying to avoid a vice president sitting on an impeachment hearing of a president. I think that the framers would find this particularly obnoxious idea. But the other thing is that, you know, there was a great and legitimate criticism of Bill Clinton, who abused the pardon power by using it to benefit his own brother. This would be 100 times worse.
Jonathan Turley of George Washington University. Jonathan, thank you.
Thanks, David.